Brooke Astor directed roughly $200 million in philanthropy during her lifetime, an amount worth well over $1 billion today. Yet the legendary philanthropist ended her life as a prisoner in her own Park Avenue penthouse. According to testimony, she was at times left sleeping on a urine-soaked couch. As her mind slowly faded to Alzheimer's, her only son systematically looted her massive fortune and stripped away her basic human dignity. This is the horrifying true story of the Brooke Astor elder abuse scandal. It proves that all the wealth in the world cannot buy mercy from the monsters living inside your own home. Before we can measure the depth of this dark tragedy, we must rewind the clock to see how this extraordinary woman was forged in the fires of both privilege and profound trauma. Roberta Brooke Russell did not start her life with a silver spoon planted firmly in her mouth. Rather, she spent her formative years packing suitcases, forever following her father across the globe. Her father, John Henry Russell Jr., was a stern, dedicated Marine Corps officer who would eventually rise to become the 16th Commandant of the Marine Corps. This military lifestyle meant that he moved his only daughter constantly, dragging her from the tropical landscapes of Hawaii to the unfamiliar streets of China, and from the Dominican Republic to Haiti. This highly peripatetic, nomadic upbringing left young Brooke, then known affectionately as Bobby, in a strange psychological state. She was simultaneously incredibly worldly, having seen the far corners of the earth, yet deeply sheltered from the emotional realities of stable, rooted domestic life. It was a fascinating paradox that would undeniably shape her future choices in both love and fortune. At the tender age of 17 in the year 1919, a naive Brooke sought what she likely thought was a permanent anchor by marrying John Dryden Cuser. He was the son of a very wealthy New Jersey businessman and the grandson of United States Senator John F. Dryden. To the outside world, this match promised absolute security, a golden ticket into the upper echelons of American aristocracy. But behind closed doors, it quickly devolved into what Brooke would later hauntingly describe as the worst years of my life. John Cuser was a monster wrapped in a tailored suit. He drank heavily, committed blatant adultery without a shred of remorse, and beat his young teenage wife with a disturbing, terrifying regularity. The abuse reached a sickening crescendo when Brooke was 6 months pregnant with their only child, a boy named Anthony Dryden Tony Cuser. During a domestic argument, her husband violently struck her across the face with such brute force that he shattered her jaw. Brooke endured 11 grueling years of this domestic terror, a prisoner to societal expectations and fear, before finally finding the immense courage to file for divorce in Reno, Nevada in 1930. She escaped with her young son and virtually nothing else, a survivor of a gilded nightmare. Her second marriage, which took place in 1932, finally brought her the genuine, unadulterated happiness she had been starved of. She married Charles Buddy Marshall, a successful Wall Street broker who treated Brooke with a gentle tenderness and profound respect she had never previously known. For 20 beautiful years, Brooke flourished. She built an impressive life for herself, working as an editor at the prestigious House and Garden magazine, where she meticulously developed the highly refined, exquisite aesthetic sense that would later heavily define her philanthropic endeavors. Her son Tony, desperate to psychologically and legally distance himself from his violently abusive biological father, legally adopted his beloved stepfather's surname when he turned 18. But the universe is rarely fair, and tragedy struck with a brutal suddenness. In 1952, Buddy Marshall collapsed from a massive heart attack and died right in front of Brooke at their Serene, Massachusetts home. High society friends immediately began to whisper, worrying deeply about poor little Brooke, who was now a widow facing terrifying financial uncertainty at the age of 48. However, Brooke was a survivor, and less than a year later she made a wildly pragmatic, life-altering decision. She married Vincent Astor, the famously temperamental heir to one of America's greatest, most historically significant fortunes. The circumstances surrounding this union were, to put it mildly, highly unusual. Vincent's second wife, Minnie, had actually orchestrated the match herself. Minnie was desperate to leave the marriage but utterly refused to officially divorce Vincent until she had personally found and vetted a suitable replacement for him. At a carefully, strategically arranged dinner party, Brooke was seated across from Vincent. The chemistry, while perhaps not born of burning passion, was undeniable in its mutual utility, and within weeks the two were engaged. Vincent Astor had inherited immense, world-shifting wealth, but he possessed very little actual happiness. His father, the legendary John Jacob Astor IV, had famously perished on the sinking of the Titanic in 1912 when Vincent was just 20 years old. That catastrophic loss, combined with a notoriously cold, emotionally barren upbringing, left Vincent highly prone to what Brooke gently referred to as a profound sadness. In her later, more candid years, Brooke openly confessed that she had loved her second husband, Buddy, far more deeply than she ever loved Vincent, whom she formally and emotionally distanced by addressing him simply as Captain. This pragmatic alliance between Brooke and the Captain brings us to the pivotal moment that would change the history of New York City forever. Brooke's marriage to Vincent Astor was a brief chapter in the grand scope of her century-long life, lasting just 5.5 years before he passed away in 1959. Yet upon his death, the reading of his will did not merely change Brooke's financial status. It transformed her existence on a molecular historical level. Vincent left his widow $2 million outright, a sum that equates to roughly $18 million in today's fiercely inflated currency. Furthermore, she received the perpetual income generated from a massive trust valued between $60 and $65 million, which represented roughly half of his entire vast estate. But far more significantly than her personal staggering wealth, Vincent left his widow with a job. He placed her in absolute control of the Vincent Astor Foundation, an organization whose officially stated, legally binding mission was shockingly brief but impossibly heavy: the alleviation of human misery. Now you have to understand the deeply patriarchal, rigid traditions of mid-century American wealth to fully grasp what happened next. When Brooke took the helm of the foundation, the board members, a collection of conservative, cigar-smoking bankers and patrician lawyers, expected her to serve merely as a pretty, grieving ceremonial figurehead. In their minds, a high society widow's job was to sip tea from porcelain cups, nod politely at their financial presentations, and blindly sign the checks while the men in the room did the actual heavy lifting of running the charity. They assumed she would be a ghostwriter of wealth, totally detached from the gritty reality of where the money was actually going. They could not have misjudged her more completely. Brooke Astor walked into that boardroom, looked at the foundation's mandate to alleviate human misery, and took it as a literal, personal crusade. Over the course of nearly 40 years, spanning from 1959 until the foundation closed its doors in 1997, Brooke Astor personally oversaw the distribution of approximately $200 million to New York institutions. To put that into a modern perspective, she directed a staggering sum equivalent to over $1,600,000,000 today. But it wasn't just the sheer breathtaking volume of money that made her an undisputed legend. It was her totally revolutionary method of giving it away. Before Brooke Astor, old money philanthropy was often a cold, distant transaction. You wrote a check to build a hospital wing. You put your family name on the side of the building in brass letters, and you attended a gala. Brooke completely shattered that mold. She transformed American philanthropy by injecting it with a deep personal boots-on-the-ground involvement that the elite class had never seen before. She absolutely refused to be a distant benefactor, safely tucked away in her Park Avenue penthouse. If you wanted the Astor Foundation's money, you had to look Brooke Astor in the eye, and she had to see exactly where her dollars were going. Impeccably dressed in tailored Chanel suits, pearls, and her trademark immaculate white gloves, Brooke physically visited every single homeless shelter, every crumbling public housing project, and every struggling youth community center that dared to request a grant from her. To some, showing up to a dilapidated neighborhood in haute couture might have seemed out of touch, but Brooke understood the profound psychology of respect. She famously explained to her critics that the people living in impoverished neighborhoods expected to see Mrs. Astor. If she dressed down in old clothes, she felt she would be patronizing them. By wearing her absolute best, she was communicating that their community center was just as important, just as worthy of her respect and formal attire as a gala at the Waldorf Astoria. She wanted to smell the air in the neighborhood she was helping. She wanted to touch the broken boilers her money was going to replace and shake the hands of the social workers who were fighting on the front lines of urban decay. She famously and frequently quoted a line from Thornton Wilder's beloved play, The Matchmaker, establishing it as her personal mantra: "Money is like manure. It's not worth a thing unless it's spread around." She firmly believed that wealth, when hoarded, simply rotted and corrupted. But when spread around strategically, it acted as a fertilizer that could make an entire city bloom. And spread it she did, with surgical precision and a boundless, fierce empathy. You have to remember that during the 1970s, New York City was teetering on the absolute brink of financial bankruptcy and cultural collapse. Crime was skyrocketing, buildings were burning, and the city's greatest institutions were literally crumbling into disrepair. Brooke Astor stepped into that void and essentially rebuilt the cultural pillars of New York City through her methodical generosity. She wasn't just funding these places, she was rescuing them. The Metropolitan Museum of Art received millions upon millions of dollars, including a highly specific, painstakingly curated $6 million grant to construct the breathtaking Astor Court. This wasn't just a generic donation. Brooke insisted on bringing master craftsmen directly from China to build a meticulously authentic Chinese garden courtyard using traditional ancient methods. She wanted New Yorkers who could never afford a plane ticket to Asia to experience true global majesty. That courtyard remains a crown jewel of the museum today. When the New York Public Library was desperate for funds to keep its doors open to the public, Brooke gifted them $10 million for necessary life-saving renovations, ensuring that the poorest child in the city still had access to the greatest literature in the world. Carnegie Hall, the Bronx Zoo, the American Museum of Natural History, and the sprawling green lungs of Central Park itself all thrived, survived, and modernized because Brooke Astor deemed them worthy of preservation. She bought new roofs for historic buildings and funded educational programs for inner-city teenagers with the exact same level of enthusiasm. Former Mayor Abraham Beame reportedly said that few private citizens had done more for New York City than Brooke Astor. She was universally recognized as the city's unofficial royal monarch. The political and social elite bowed to her influence. In 1998, President Bill Clinton stood beside her and draped the prestigious Presidential Medal of Freedom around her neck, officially dubbing her America's guardian angel in front of the entire nation. By her 100th birthday in 2002, Brooke Astor stood not just as a social icon, but as one of the defining civic patrons of modern New York. Her legendary dinner parties were the absolute epicenter of American influence. If you received an invitation to the Astor residence, you had officially arrived. Her dining room gathered the ultimate, most ruthless power brokers from the realms of politics, high finance, and the fine arts, all of them eager to sit at the right hand of the woman who practically owned the city's heart. She was the city's most beloved, revered, and untouchable philanthropist. Yet, here is the terrifying, irreconcilable paradox of Brooke Astor's existence. As the flashbulbs popped, as the champagne flowed in her honor, and as millions of strangers praised her boundless compassion, a dark, festering, decades-old wound was quietly rotting the very core of her own family. It is a haunting psychological contradiction. How could a woman possess enough boundless empathy to save a homeless stranger on the street, yet remain completely, willfully blind to the emotional starvation of her own flesh and blood? This deeply personal failure, hidden behind the Chanel suits and the massive charitable donations, was a tragedy that would soon erupt into a grotesque international scandal. It was a ticking time bomb of resentment that threatened to completely destroy the legacy of the woman who had given away hundreds of millions of dollars to heal the world, yet utterly failed to heal the broken, neglected boy living in her very own shadow. To understand the monster that Anthony Marshall would eventually become, we must deeply analyze the psychological soil in which he was planted. Anthony Dryden Marshall entered the world on May 30th, 1924, under the darkest, most traumatic circumstances imaginable. Circumstances that inherently poisoned his relationship with his mother from his very first breath. In later accounts, Brooke suggested that her first marriage was marked by extreme trauma, and some biographers have linked that trauma to the emotional distance she later maintained from Tony. Tony's biological father had already violently broken his mother's jaw while she was carrying him in her womb. For Brooke, looking at her son was likely a daily agonizing reminder of the man who had tortured her. That trauma may help explain why Brooke's relationship with her son later appeared emotionally distant and deeply strained. When Brooke finally escaped accuser and married Buddy Marshall, she made a choice that would permanently scar young Tony. The 8-year-old boy was unceremoniously packed up and sent away to a series of strict boarding schools. Brooke was busy building a glamorous, safe new life for herself, and she built it entirely without him. She actively chose her new husband over her own flesh and blood, a devastating pattern of abandonment she would repeat throughout Tony's entire childhood and adolescence. To make matters worse, despite giving the boy his last name, Buddy Marshall never formally legally adopted Tony. He never fully welcomed the boy into the warmth of the family unit, leaving young Tony to grow up feeling like a permanent, unwanted outsider trespassing in his own home. When Brooke married the astronomically wealthy Vincent Astor in 1953, the maternal rejection intensified from cold neglect to active dramatic exclusion. Vincent Astor utterly despised Tony. To satisfy her moody, wealthy third husband, Brooke simply shut her son out of her life almost entirely. She would cruelly confide to her high society friends about her only child, stating flatly, he never accomplished anything. She later admitted to close confidants that Tony had disappointed her so thoroughly as a human being that his existence was the primary reason she decided against ever having more children. Their relationship operated through what keen societal observers described as a tremendous, agonizing push-pull dynamic. Brooke demanded Tony's physical presence at events to maintain the visual illusion of a happy family, while simultaneously and sadistically withholding the genuine affection and maternal approval he so desperately, achingly craved. He became known to the world not as an individual, but primarily as Brooke Astor's son, a suffocating shadow identity that defined and consumed his entire existence. Yet what makes this dynamic so deeply tragic is that Tony Marshall actually built an incredibly distinguished, objectively impressive career, doing so completely in spite of his mother's emotional abandonment. He bravely served his country as a Marine during the World War II, earning a Purple Heart after valiantly leading his platoon through the hellscape of Iwo Jima. Following the war, he joined the CIA, directly contributing to the highly classified development of the U-2 spy plane program. His intellect and diplomatic skills led the State Department to appoint him as the United States ambassador to Madagascar from 1969 to 1971, followed by appointments to Trinidad and Tobago, Kenya, and the Seychelles throughout the 1970s. He even pivoted to the arts, winning a highly coveted Tony Award as a Broadway producer and successfully publishing multiple books. By any reasonable objective metric of society, Tony Marshall was a massively successful man. Yet looking through the hypercritical, impossible-to-please eyes of his mother, he remained a total failure. This profound lack of maternal love created a hollow man, a man whose personal life was just as troubled as his childhood. 2 of his marriages ended in bitter divorce, but it was his third marriage, taking place in 1992, when Tony was 68 years old, that would light the fuse on a bomb that would blow the Astor legacy to pieces. Enter Charlene Gilbert. This final marriage would serve as the catalyst for devastating, horrific consequences for Brooke Astor. Charlene had previously been married to Paul Gilbert, the humble Episcopal minister who presided over Brooke's century-old picturesque church in Northeast Harbor, Maine. For 2 decades, Charlene had lived a very modest, quiet life as a minister's wife. Her primary role had been serving the unimaginably wealthy summer residents who attended Sunday services, which prominently included the Astor family. Family members and staff later portrayed Charlene as deeply ambitious and strongly motivated by status and access. In the late 1980s, Charlene began showing up at Brooke's sprawling Maine estate, Cove End, at 7 o'clock in the morning, under the guise of taking brisk morning walks with Tony. The walks quickly escalated into a full-blown affair. By 1989, Charlene had completely abandoned her minister husband for the Astor heir. They officially married in 1992, at a time when Brooke was 90 years old and just beginning to show the very early subtle signs of cognitive decline. Brooke Astor, a woman of impeccable old-world refinement, absolutely loathed her new daughter-in-law with a startling, visceral intensity. She would point at Charlene and dismissively refer to her simply as that, constantly complaining to her elite circle about the women's glaring lack of class and refinement. The Astor estate staff were equally repulsed, secretly nicknaming Charlene Miss Piggy due to what they perceived as her insatiable greed and relentless aggressive social climbing. Multiple witnesses, from housekeepers to high society friends, later testified under oath that Charlene was the absolute dominant force in the marriage. She wore the pants. Tony made absolutely no significant decisions without consulting her first. This toxic marriage perfectly coincided with a mounting, crushing financial pressure on Tony. The psychology of this is fascinating and dark. Despite being the only son of a woman worth well over $100 million, Tony had actually received relatively little direct wealth from his mother over the decades. He was forced to sit back and painfully watch as the woman who had emotionally starved him wrote checks for hundreds of millions of dollars to total strangers, to zoos and to libraries, while keeping him on a tight financial leash. In the early 1980s, Brooke had appointed Tony as her official portfolio manager, paying him an annual salary of $450,000, which is roughly $1.2 million in today's dollars. To the average citizen, this sounds like a fortune. But in the ultra-wealthy circles Tony and Charlene ran in, it felt like peasants' wages. It was not nearly enough to fund the lifestyle Charlene desired, which included multiple lavish homes, expensive tastes, and the burning need to compete with his mother's legendary status. The simmering resentment finally found its golden opportunity in the year 2000. Brooke Astor received a devastating medical diagnosis that would change the trajectory of everyone's lives: Alzheimer's disease. Tony immediately and deliberately kept the diagnosis a closely guarded secret, even as his mother's brilliant mind began to visibly, tragically deteriorate over the following years. By 2001 and 2002, close friends noticed that Brooke was slipping away. The razor-sharp wit was gone. She repeated herself constantly, became terribly confused about her physical location, and began failing to recognize lifelong acquaintances. In one particularly heartbreaking incident following a 1997 book party, a guest found the 94-year-old philanthropist standing out on the New York sidewalk, dressed to the nines in haute couture, looking around with wide, terrified eyes, having absolutely no idea where she was or what she was doing. As his mother's formidable mind crumbled into dust, Tony did not step up to protect her. Instead, he saw exactly what his ambitious wife Charlene recognized immediately: a highly lucrative opportunity to finally aggressively claim what he believed he had been owed for a lifetime of rejection. By 2004, Brooke Astor's Alzheimer's disease had ruthlessly progressed to the point where she could no longer even recognize the faces of her own grandsons. When her grandson, Philip Marshall, visited her at her iconic Park Avenue apartment in March of 2004, he found her deeply disoriented and terrified. It wasn't until Philip gently held her and reassured her, saying, "We're family, we love you," that she finally squeezed his hand and her panicked breathing slowed. That terrifying encounter haunted Philip for months. But what Philip and other close observers were about to discover, hidden behind the mahogany doors of that apartment, was far, far more sinister than mere cognitive decline. Brooke Astor, widely seen as New York's guardian angel, had given away roughly $200 million to public causes. Yet in her final years, witnesses said she was living in shocking squalor. The 104-year-old billionaire was found sleeping on a cheap, ruined sofa that absolutely reeked of dog urine. The glamorous woman who once wore exclusively custom Chanel was now dressed in nightgowns, so torn, frayed, and ragged that her horrified nurses had to physically turn them inside out just to hide the worst of the damage. Her beloved dachshunds, Boise and Girlsy, dogs she had cherished for years and for whom she had once thrown elaborate, catered high society parties, were now treated as nuisances. Tony ordered them to be confined to a small pantry, locked away from the woman who loved them. When the dogs were occasionally released out of fear and neglect, they defecated all over the apartment's priceless Aubusson carpets. Tony strictly forbade the staff members from properly cleaning or maintaining the apartment, letting the luxury estate rot around his mother. Her diet, once the envy of Manhattan, was reduced to a sickening, repetitive slop. She was fed pureed peas, carrots, and bland oatmeal, institutional gruel, bearing absolutely no resemblance to the exquisite gourmet meals she had enjoyed for decades. Why? Because Tony had coldly fired her beloved French chef simply to cut costs and pocket the savings. Brooke's expensive high-end face creams, essential for her fragile, aging skin, were thrown out and replaced with cheap petroleum jelly. When her 104th birthday approached, Tony flatly refused to buy her a new dress to celebrate. Perhaps the most sickening detail of this physical abuse was the battle over her safety. When Brooke's desperate nurses requested a mere $5 to $10 to purchase basic non-skid socks to prevent the frail centenarian from slipping on the hardwood floors, Tony aggressively denied the petty cash request. The nurses, earning a fraction of what Tony made, had to purchase the socks with their own money. Witnesses described a steady stripping away of Brooke's comfort and dignity, turning her once Grand Park Avenue home into a place of neglect. He aggressively reduced her vital medications, severely limited her doctor visits, and issued a terrifying mandate to her medical staff. Under no circumstances were they to take Brooke to an emergency room or call 911 without contacting him first, effectively holding her health hostage. He even refused to purchase a hospital bed with safety rails, leading to Brooke falling out of bed multiple times, bruising her frail body. But the physical degradation was only a smokescreen for the massive calculated financial plunder occurring in the background. Perhaps the cruelest and most symbolic theft involved Brooke's most cherished possession. In February 2002, Tony manipulated his mother, who was already exhibiting clear, medically documented signs of severe dementia, into selling her favorite painting. It was Childa Hassam's Flags Fifth Avenue, a breathtaking impressionist masterpiece depicting the bustling, patriotic streets of New York. The painting had hung proudly above her library fireplace for 32 years. Brooke had purchased it in 1970 for $172,100, about $1.2 million today. It was the visual anchor of her home. Tony looked his confused, terrified mother in the eye and lied to her. He told her she was going broke. He told her that she desperately needed the cash and that she could not even afford to buy new dresses unless she sold the painting. This was a calculated sociopathic deception, considering that at that exact moment, Brooke had more than $150 million in highly liquid assets and was receiving an annual guaranteed income of approximately $2 million from her trust. But with her judgment entirely clouded by Alzheimer's, she believed the cruel lies of her only son. Tony facilitated the sale of the painting to a Santa Fe art dealer named Gerald Peters for $10 million, which was several $1,000,000 more than any Hassam painting had ever previously sold for at auction. From this sale, Tony brazenly pocketed a $2 million commission, a sum equating to roughly $6.7 million in today's money. The dealer subsequently flipped the painting shortly after for between $20 and $25 million. Brooke lost the painting, while Tony benefited from the transaction through a large commission and the structure surrounding the sale. But the greed didn't stop there. The tax fraud surrounding this transaction was incredibly brazen. Tony and his accountants filed paperwork listing the painting's original purchase price as $7.4 million instead of the actual $172,100. This massive illegal inflation of the cost basis fraudulently reduced the capital gains taxes owed to the government by approximately $1 million. The plundering accelerated. Tony and Charlene engineered the permanent closure of Holly Hill, Brooke's breathtaking 64-acre Westchester County estate. This was a magnificent property boasting 24 rooms, 13 bedrooms, and sprawling luxurious gardens. Brooke had explicitly, repeatedly stated in her lucid years that this was exactly where she wanted to spend her final days. But in January 2005, Tony abruptly shut the massive house down, ostensibly to reduce expenses. When Brooke's fiercely loyal butler, Christopher Ely, bravely complained to Tony about his mother's rapidly deteriorating living conditions, Tony fired him on the spot. Then, in an act of pure to full vindictiveness, Tony ordered the magnificent gardens that Brooke had lovingly curated for decades to be completely plowed under and destroyed. When confronted, Tony offered a sickeningly manipulative excuse. He claimed that seeing the blooming flowers caused him tearful memories of his mother in her prime. To hide this abuse, Tony built a fortress around his mother. Longtime, powerful friends like former First Lady Nancy Reagan, political titan Henry Kissinger, billionaire David Rockefeller, and socialite Annette de la Renta found visiting Brooke increasingly impossible, as Tony strictly gate-kept access to the apartment. Meanwhile, the looting reached astronomical heights. Beyond the $2 million painting commission and his heavily inflated salary, Tony was freely using his dying mother's money as his personal piggy bank. He used her funds to pay the captain of a $920,000 luxury yacht he had bought for himself. He took her money to invest in risky Broadway theatrical productions to stroke his own ego. He used her accounts to maintain his own private real estate properties, and he even audaciously transferred $100,000 of Brooke's money directly to his wife Charlene's religious congregation. Tony thought he had executed the perfect, undetectable crime. He was the legal guardian, the power of attorney, and the only son. But he had severely underestimated his own flesh and blood. He had underestimated his son Philip, who had been quietly, meticulously documenting every single instance of abuse, preparing to drop a legal bomb that would tear the Astor family apart forever. In 2006, Philip Marshall found himself standing at the edge of an agonizing Shakespearean moral cliff. He had to make a choice that would destroy his own life as he knew it, expose his own father as a criminal abuser, or stay silent and watch his beloved grandmother suffer in squalor until she died. Philip was not a socialite. He was a respected professor of historic preservation at Roger Willie, Ames University in Rhode Island. Unlike his father, Philip had maintained a deeply loving, close relationship with Brooke. During his regular visits to New York, he had witnessed the horrifying, deteriorating conditions firsthand. He knew that blowing the whistle would mean total excommunication from his father and the absolute forfeiture of his inheritance. But his moral compass was unwavering. He later told the New York Post with absolute clarity, "If it was at the cost of anything I was to inherit, I just don't care." It is a beautiful sentiment, but viewed through the lens of history, those words are profoundly heartbreaking. He walked into a New York court and officially filed a guardianship petition seeking to immediately strip his father, Tony, of all legal control over Brooke Astor. The petition contained allegations so serious, so deeply disturbing, that when they leaked to the press 6 days later, they brought the entire city of New York to a screeching halt. Philip meticulously detailed his father's chilling pattern of neglect, exposing the squalid living conditions, the rampant financial exploitation, and the deliberate, cruel isolation of one of the city's most iconic and beloved figures. Philip did not fight this war alone. He rallied an extraordinary, undeniable coalition of high society heavyweights. Annette de la Renta, Brooke's fiercest and closest friend, filed a sworn affidavit supporting the guardianship change. Financier David Rockefeller and former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger threw the full crushing weight of their immense reputations behind Philip's claims. The media explosion was instantaneous and deafening. The New York Daily News splashed massive front-page headlines reading, "Disaster for Mrs. Astor." The horrifying details, the dog urine-soaked sofa, the torn nightgowns turned inside out, the revolting pureed peas, and the cruel denial of basic medications filled the tabloid pages, sparking outrage from Park Avenue to the Bronx. The judicial response was swift and merciless. A New York judge granted Philip's emergency request immediately, officially stripping Tony Marshall of all authority over his mother's life and finances. The court appointed Annette de la Renta as Brooke's temporary legal guardian and mandated J.P. Morgan Chase Bank to take absolute control of her hemorrhaging finances. Brooke was immediately removed from the toxic apartment, briefly hospitalized for evaluation, and then finally moved back to her beloved Holly Hill estate. Philip and Mrs. de la Renta had aggressively reopened and fully staffed the mansion. For the final year of her life, Brooke Astor was once again surrounded by lush beauty, dignity, and genuine, loving care. She peacefully passed away on August 13th, 2007, at the astonishing age of 105. But Philip's rescue mission was only the beginning. His civil petition had acted as a flare, catching the attention of the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, which immediately launched a massive, sprawling criminal investigation. What the elite financial prosecutors uncovered in Tony's ledgers led to what they famously dubbed Grand Theft Astor, a highly complex, systematic, and ruthless scheme to defraud an elderly woman whose mind had failed her. On October 8, 2009, after 5 grueling months of explosive testimony and 12 tense, highly contentious days of jury deliberation, 85-year-old Anthony Marshall faced his reckoning. He was convicted on 14 serious criminal counts, including first-degree grand larceny, conspiracy, and scheming to defraud. His co-defendant, a shady trust and estate attorney named Francis X. Morrissey, Jr., was found guilty on all 6 counts against him, importantly including forgery in the second degree. The trial itself was a spectacle unlike anything New York had seen in decades. The witness list read like a who's who of global power, featuring gripping testimony from Henry Kissinger, broadcasting legend Barbara Walters, Annette de la Renta, David Rockefeller, and Vartan Gregorian. The prosecutors presented a mountain of overwhelming, undeniable evidence. They showed the jury that between 2001 and 2007, exactly while Brooke's Alzheimer's was actively destroying her capacity to make informed financial decisions, Tony had illegally gifted himself a staggering 208% raise, secretly inflating his annual compensation from roughly $450,000 to $50,000 to a massive $2.5 million. But the most damning evidence revolved around the alteration of her final wishes. Tony had conspired with attorney Francis Morrissey to sneak 3 distinct codicils amendments into Brooke's 2002 will. These codicils effectively hijacked approximately $60 million that Brooke had explicitly earmarked for her beloved charities, illegally redirecting the vast fortune directly into Tony's absolute control. The third and final codicil became the smoking gun for the forgery charge against Morrissey. The prosecution brought in top handwriting expert Gus Lesnovich. He meticulously examined 240 known, verified signatures of Brooke Astor, dating from 1953 all the way to 2004. He then placed them next to the signature on the third codicil, dated March 3, 2004. The discrepancy was dramatic and undeniable. No doubt that it's not Brooke's signature, Lesnovich firmly concluded to the jury. He pointed out the devastating forensic details. The fake signature was written far too smoothly for a 102-year-old woman suffering from advanced Alzheimer's. The letters were fluidly connected in ways Brooke had never connected them in her entire life. Most damningly, under microscopic analysis, the signature bore the undeniable telltale signs of having been physically traced over. Justice A. Kirk Bartley, Jr. looked down from the bench on December 21, 2009, and sentenced both Anthony Marshall and Francis Morrissey to 1 to 3 years in state prison. It was a stunning, precipitous fall from grace for a man who had once been an American ambassador. Ultimately, due to his immense privilege and failing health, Tony served only 8 weeks inside the harsh walls of the Fishkill Correctional Facility. A parole board granted him a highly controversial medical release in August 2013, citing his advanced Parkinson's disease and congestive heart failure. He spent his final year in luxury, dying on November 30th, 2014, at the age of 90. He took his secrets to the grave, completely refusing to ever express a single word of genuine remorse for the torture he inflicted on his mother. While Tony escaped the full physical weight of his prison sentence, the legal system ensured He did not escape with the stolen fortune. The incredibly complex estate settlement, finally resolved in March 2012, legally validated Brooke's original 2002 will, totally and permanently rejecting all three of the forged, fraudulent codicils. The financial penalties levied against Tony were financially ruinous. He was forced to pay a massive $12.3 million fine, millions more in estate taxes, and a staggering $11.6 million in legal defense fees. By the time the dust settled, Tony's actual final inheritance was drastically slashed to less than $3 million. The remaining $100 million of the Astor fortune was finally liberated. It flowed exactly where Brooke had always intended it to go, back to the people and institutions of New York. Approximately $20 million was awarded to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. $15 million rejuvenated the New York Public Library, and an incredible $30 million was established to create the Brooke Astor Fund for New York City education. Millions more were distributed to vital institutions ranging from the Brooklyn Museum to the Wildlife Conservation Society, cementing her legacy as the city's eternal benefactor. And what of the grandson who risked everything to save her? Philip Marshall, who successfully saved his grandmother but ultimately lost his $9 million inheritance when his vengeful father officially cut him out of his will, stood tall. He ever regretted his difficult, noble decision for a single second. Recognizing his true calling, Philip left his comfortable university professorship to found Beyond Brooke, a passionate, relentless nonprofit organization dedicated entirely to elder justice advocacy, ensuring that the horrors his grandmother faced could be prevented for others. If you visit the quiet rolling greens of Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in Westchester County today, you will find Brooke Astor's gravestone. Carved into the cold stone is the precise inscription she had requested long before her mind faded. "I had a wonderful life." It is a beautiful sentiment, but when viewed through the lens of history, they are profoundly heartbreaking words. They belong to a woman whose final, most vulnerable years were completely defined by terrifying isolation, calculated degradation, and the ultimate betrayal at the hands of the very son she bore 83 years earlier during a violent, abusive marriage. The case suggests a relationship shaped by decades of resentment, dependence, and unresolved emotional injury. Brooke Astor's life leaves us with a haunting truth. She could win the admiration of an entire city, but not the loyalty of her own blood. Her millions built cultural monuments that will outlast us all, yet her most enduring legacy might be the terrifying lesson her final years teach us. Extreme wealth is a magnificent tool, but it is a profoundly fragile shield. When the mind fades, the checkbook closes, and the glamorous dinner parties finally end, the only thing standing between you and the darkness is the character of the people you raised. What is your verdict on the incredibly complex life of Brooke Astor? Does her unprecedented public generosity outweigh her private failings as a mother? Or is her story the ultimate proof that money can never truly insulate you from the consequences of a broken home? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next video.